give ourselves some more space here, make it look nice and pretty. And oops, got a colon in there instead of the semicolon. Fix that real quick. I'm going to do a console.writeLine, and for this line, we're going to say data entered. Give it a tab. Oh, get a little colon in there. Tab it over. Then we're going to say number of times entered. And so this is just going to be a header for our next section of data. And for this last bit of output here, we're going to use a for statement, kind of similar to that for each statement. But in this one, we're going to say for each integer I, once again creating that variable I. We're going to start it out as 0. And the program, this is going to run as long as I is less than counter.length. And finally, after each time it runs the program, it's going to increment it by 1. And notice this little plus plus here, same thing that we used earlier on in the code, counter in value integer, increment it by 1. That little plus plus, that's just saying increment it by 1. And get our curly brackets in there. And we're going to say, also another little quick note here, this I is less than counter.length. Once again, counter is our array. .length is referring to how many different indexes we have in counter. That's really determined by this number right here. We could go ahead and we could put in as long as I is less than 11, or so as long as I is less than 11, then it would do the same exact thing. But this is a little bit more dynamic. You know, if you end up changing the program later on, then this works a whole lot better, makes it a whole lot easier here. So you don't have to go through and rewrite every single line of code. And we're going to do a console.writeLine. And for this one, it's going to get a little bit crazy here with the representative numbers. So we have our first reference number, tab it over twice just so it lines up properly, and we got our second reference number. Going to end that string, throw in our comma here, and the first number that we're going to be referencing, it's an I. So this I here, that's that I that we created right there. So this I is going to represent our index value. It's also going to represent the value that we entered. So what's going to happen is this number here is going to display as our index. And then we're going to say counter so we're going to take the value within that index and we're going to display that. So this is going to be the number that was written and how many times it was written. Now there's one little problem with this right now though. What's going to happen is that for every single one of these values, it's going to go through and give us this output here. So say that the user never entered a 0 into the program. When we get to this point here, what's going to happen is it's going to write 0 and it's going to say it was entered 0 times because that's what's going to be the value for counter of 0. And we don't want to see that. We only want to see the ones where they actually did enter something. So to fix that, we're going to use another if statement. We're going to say as long as the counter, the value within the counter, does not equal 0, then you can go ahead and write that little bit of code. So what's happening now is instead when they get to this write statement here and they see okay, for the value the user never entered any values into 0. So the value within the index of 0 is going to be 0. So it's going to get to this and say, okay, that's equal to 0. So we're not going to write anything there. It's a little bit confusing with 0, so let me just try that again with 1. So say that when we get to this point here, it's going to, and the user never entered a value of 1, it's going to take the index of 1, it's going to see that that index is 0. So we never entered any values, it never got incremented beyond 0. And so it's going to see this and it is equal to 0, so it's not going to write this. Any value that was incremented, it's not going to be equal to 0, so it will go ahead and write that line there. And so that is our program. And let's just go ahead and run this real quick. And it's pulling up the console right now. So here's our console. It's still loading the program right now. And there we go. So here's our input. I'm going to go ahead and enter a couple of values here. And you notice that it's just going to keep on looping this until I actually entered -99. So I can enter any number of values as many times as I'd like, just as long as they're between 0 and 10. And when I enter a number that's not that, I do get a little error message there saying that it did not enter a value between 0 and 10. And it asks me to, goes back into the instructions, tells me to do it again. And I can keep on going there, or I can end the program by saying -99. And it gives me my output. This time here, I entered 13 different values. Now that did not count -99. Also didn't count 23. So it only counted the valid values there. And then these are the values that I did enter. So you can see for 0, I entered that 1 time. Skip down here, I got 3. I entered that one 5 times there. I also got 10 1 time. So these are all the different values that were entered, the unique values, and the number of times that they were entered. And so that is how we can use an array to keep track of which values the user entered. It's a pretty simple process, kind of a unique solution to how we can do that using kind of a tally system instead of actually recording each individual entry using something like an array list. But I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Definitely go ahead and check out the CS file that I'm going to post along with this, and that way you can take a look at this, reference code, whatever you like. But hopefully you got a little bit out of it, and I will see you next time.